Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Volodymyr Babich, who is a professor of operations and information management at Georgetown University. Professor Babich's research interests are at the interface of operations and finance, supply risk management, supply chain management, stochastic modeling, and risk management. He serves as an associate editor for management science, M&SOM, and Naval Research Logistics, and is a research editor for production and operations management journals. Welcome, Vlad.
Thank you.
I want to start with one of your papers entitled, Does Crowdfunding Benefit Entrepreneurs and Venture Capital Investors?, in which you study how a new development in entrepreneurship, crowdfunding, not that new anymore, but relatively new, interacts with more traditional financing sources such as venture capital investors and bank financing. So you're looking at, sort of the, if an entrepreneur goes out and does some crowdfunding, there is some information revealed to possible sort of a traditional funding sources like taking a debt from a bank or venture capital, and you're looking at what that information revelation, what effects those information revelations have in the market, right?
That's right. It's a very interesting area in general, the entrepreneurial finance. It's a very important area, right? So for most of the entrepreneurs, there's really no separation between the question of raising money and succeeding, and doing marketing, doing product development. It's kind of everything has to be taken together. And so in this paper, we are looking, just as you mentioned, at this new source of financing that became very, very popular since 2009 or so, when the Kickstarter became the platform where everybody would go for crowdfunding financing projects.
Yeah, it was really popular, I guess, early on. I remember, Brad, that even Google actually considered going on the crowdfunding platform.
Yeah. There were lots of interesting projects at the time, from trying to finance a mission to the moon, if I remember correctly, to getting financing for movies, dances, art. It's actually a very interesting development in general. It's went away from the front pages of the business publications, but as the concept, as the development, it's still very much alive, and the platforms, they continue to grow. It's just that they have been sunsetted by new technologies like blockchain, for example, that became more prominent. The interesting part for me there was that the crowdfunding in itself typically is not enough to finance the entire product. It's just one of the steps that you have to go through as entrepreneur, trying to get your idea off the ground. And what we wanted to study is the interaction. The idea that this is a catalyst, potentially, for getting additional resources going forward. And indeed, there's
so
some...
in some sense...
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, in some sense, it's sort of a kickstart or seed funding, right? The company still needs to go out and get more money, but it sort of get them going. Yeah.
Exactly. And we saw empirical evidence and anecdotal evidence going both ways. There's certainly plenty of evidence showing that if company like or projects like Oculus Rift is successful on Kickstarter, it goes on being extremely successful in the VC area and then ultimately becomes a successful product. But we also had evidence that some of the projects that received the financing on Kickstarter then failed to raise money with the VCs. Or even worse, some of the projects that seems to be getting financing initially from the VCs didn't get as much interest after they were successful on the Kickstarter.
And so when the entrepreneur...
Curious why, right?
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's curious, why is this happening, right? So what is the Kickstarter campaigns, successful campaigns, what do they do to those interactions between entrepreneurs and VCs and regular investors? How does it change it? And that's what this paper is studying, trying to understand if you get the signal, and the signal comes in two ways, right? So you get, if your project is successful, first of all, you get a verifiable signal about how much people like the product, like your idea, right? These are your customers to whom you're selling your product, effectively pre-selling ahead of time. And this is a more powerful signal than you would do through market analysis, through polling, through getting together 100 people, 1,000 people, and asking, would you buy this product? Would you buy that version of the product? So people actually buying your product ahead of time. So this is a very strong signal that they like it if they're willing to fund it ahead of time. And then, of course, you get in the
sort of it's sort of wrapping money raising and market testing into a single activity, right? So, when an entrepreneur starts off, he or she doesn't really have a good idea of market acceptance, and hence he or she doesn't really have a good idea of the valuation of the idea, right? And so when they go on a platform like this, they're getting a market test, they're getting a signal as to market acceptance, and that resolves some uncertainty from a valuation perspective, right? That is one of the issues, not necessarily an issue, but it has implications for both entrepreneur and the capital provider.
Exactly. Now, it sounds like it should always be a good thing to be successful in this type of market and this type of step. And in fact, VCs often ask the entrepreneurs to go through the crowdfunding step as a way of gaining this information. So this is a way for the VCs to figure out should they continue funding the project or not. But we also have that evidence that, on the other hand, some projects are not doing so well after being successful. And so what we try to do, we try to create a framework for us to think about this problem. And our framework is a theoretical framework. It's a framework of constructing a model, of thinking about the process of interactions between the entrepreneur and the sources of financing, and adding the crowdfunding to this mix, and using the knowledge that we have of the game theory and contract design, and the knowledge from area of finance on the sources of financial frictions that might prevent good projects from being funded. We then able to understand why crowdfunding has this kind of very divergent effects. On one hand, it could be positive, on the other hand, it could be negative. For which circumstances is it positive? For which circumstances is it negative? So that's where the paper is making a contribution.
Yeah. So what were your conclusions from the paper?
Like most academic papers, the answer is always it depends. And the whole right. And for us, what's interesting to us is being able to explain the non-obvious part, which is why would the venture capitalists be worse off if the project is successful in the campaign? Why would the entrepreneurs be worse off if the project is not successful in the campaign? And kind of more generally, if we take the policymaker perspective, if we step back and we say, do we want to encourage in our economy development of crowdfunding platforms? Are they the kind of tide that rises all boats? Are they benefiting everybody, all of the entrepreneurs? Are they all going to be better off if we offer them this option to go through the crowdfunding campaign? And finding that the answer is no, not everybody will be better off. And the explanation comes from observing that for some of the projects, the crowdfunding, by revealing to the entrepreneurs and everybody else credibly how good the project is, it increases the competition between the various financing sources. And although competition, of course, is a good thing, it's not always good if this leaves too little money for the venture capitalists. Because now there's much less uncertainty whether or not the project is good or bad. More risk-averse investors, a different kind of investors, regular investors, are willing to come in and finance the project. And so venture capitalists don't have much of the upside left for them because of this competition from other investors to pick up the project. Now,
and also, I would imagine the negotiation abilities of the entrepreneur, because there is valuation that is less uncertainty from an entrepreneurial perspective too, right?
That's right. So the entrepreneur gets to keep much bigger chunk of the value of the project. So they are much less dependent on the financing from venture capitalists. So they can really have a stronger position in the negotiations. But stronger position is not necessarily a good thing if negotiation breaks down.
Right.
And this is what.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of. Yeah, no, I was just wondering, it's sort of interesting, if you say that this actually makes the markets more efficient, but then if the VC model is fundamentally an arbitrage between their know-how and let's call it the entrepreneur's ignorance,
and other investors,
so if the VC, sorry,
and other investors' ignorance too. Right, so they are acting on the condition that's private to them, the VCs.
So they have some expectation. So it is sort of an information arbitrage. That is what the business model is based on.
Right.
And if you say, the crowdfunding actually makes that market much more efficient, but unfortunately, from a very practical perspective, I think what you're finding is that either the deals don't go through because upside is not high enough from a VC expectation perspective, or the upside is competed away, and again, with the same result. So some of the deals are not going through. So the entrepreneur sort of left behind with just the small amount of money that they raised from the crowdfunding action.
Yeah. So there's another element in our analysis that makes the entrepreneur really concerned about losing the VC financing. And that is, unlike regular investors, unlike banks, VCs, they bring other value to the project besides the money. Many of the VCs have experience funding similar kind of projects. they have networks to which they connect the entrepreneur to. They might have worked with the contract manufacturer. They might have worked with particular marketing division. They might have excellent management team that they can send to entrepreneur to help them with the process. And so there are many non-monetary benefits of having good VCs in your project. So if you cannot compensate the VCs for that, and if the crowdfunding somehow takes away the upside for the VCs to participate, then they might not be willing to share those additional benefits, non-monetary benefits, with the entrepreneur. And this is when the entrepreneur loses out.
Right. And so from an entrepreneurial perspective here, crowdfunding could be okay. It gives you market test. It gives you market acceptance signal.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily, they shouldn't take that as a necessary view into valuation because, right?
That's correct. In fact, we would argue that for the most part, crowdfunding is fantastic development. For the most part, crowdfunding benefits everybody. For most of the projects, you get to learn how valuable or non-valuable your product is. And it's a good idea to learn that your product is not that interesting to the potential customers earlier on before you invest significant amount of money and effort on trying to develop it before it ultimately fails, right? So crowdfunding is a fantastic market testing mechanism that gives you this tremendous value of learning about the market. It's a fantastic mechanism for attracting investors, right? So there's a still significant positive element from crowdfunding in being able to signal to VCs and other investors how wonderful your project is, so they come in and they give you money. So you resolve these information asymmetries that might stop the investors from giving you money. The reason I'm emphasizing the surprising element is because the obvious elements, they're typically in the press, they're typically in the media, and everybody kind of knows the predictable element of crowdfunding. The crowdfunding is fantastic, except it's not always fantastic, not for every project. And this is where this paper makes that contribution. We are pointing out not just the benefits, and there are plenty of those, but figuring out that there could be downsides. That's the surprise, and that's the novel. That's where we learn new things.
Yeah, it is quite interesting. Something that you don't, it's counterintuitive in some sense, right? You would imagine getting more information, market test, and even some money early on is beneficial for everybody, both for the starting company as well as the later capital provider.
Yep.
But that revelation is not necessarily leading to the best outcome in some cases.
Not in every...
I want to jump into another. Yeah, go ahead.
Yep, just confirming what you said.
Yeah. So I want to jump into another paper. So completely different area. Promoting solar panel investments, feed-in tariff versus tax rebate policies. So we have had kind of different policies, right? I guess in Germany there is a feed-in tariff policy, whether they basically give the installer of the solar panels a guaranteed stream of payments. Whereas in the US, we tend to have tax breaks or tax rebates or whatever they call it,
right,
for that initial investment. And so you're looking at here, these two policies, which are actually quite different. One is trying to get people to invest early and then take some of that investment hit away from them, but they are then kind of exposed to all the revenue uncertainties downstream. Whereas other ones saying, okay, you go ahead and invest, but we will guarantee you some of the revenues downstream. So you're looking at these policies and asking which one might be a better policy.
Right. Yep. The key word there is variability, and the different kind of variability that households that make a decision whether or not to invest in solar panels are exposed to. When we started thinking about this problem, our initial gut feel was that it doesn't really matter as long as you customize the policy such that the present value of the benefits from the feed-in-tariff payments, right? These are the guaranteed payments from the policy, match the tax deduction that you get on the tax rebate. The household shouldn't care which one is offered, and it's purely a matter of maybe political convenience or whatever else, why one country implements one policy and another country or countries implement other set of policies. But the more we try to explore this question, the more surprising answers we were getting. And then we realized that what's driving this kind of surprising answers, the fact that there are actually reasons for the households and for the government to prefer one policy over another. There are systematic reasons that have to do with different forms of variability. The idea there comes from the fact that the households, they're making decisions dynamically. When the government offers a policy like feed-in-tariff or tax rebates, the households, they don't have to that instant go and buy the solar panels. They have some time to think about it. They have some time to process information. They have time to make decisions dynamically. The reason this is important is because over time, the prices of electricity, even at the retail level, and the cost of the solar panels, they fluctuate. They change and they change randomly. And what that creates is the behavior of the households that they don't want to give up an option of installing the panels at the more favorable conditions in the future, or when the prices of electricity have turned in their favor even more. So the idea is that if you install panels on top of your house, you're giving up an option of not having done it. And that option is valuable if the environment in which you operate as a household has variability, has randomness in it. And so if we think about what randomness is there, right? We have those two dimensions. We have electricity prices and we have the cost of installation. So electricity prices affect the cash flows over time, whereas the cost of installation, it's a one-time cost on which you get tax rebate. And so it seems like the two policies, the feed-in tariff, that essentially says, regardless what the price of electricity in the market is, we, the government, we will pay you a fixed rate. It's a guaranteed price for a long period of time. That will take away the variability in the price from the household. But if the government gives you tax rebate, they reduce the amount of variability in the cost of the installation that you're exposed to as a household. And the two have strategic consequences.
Right. So the feed-in tariff reduces revenue side uncertainty. The tax rebate reduces the cost side uncertainty. But it's also the case, Brad, I think, I was just thinking about this. So in both cases, let's say the NPV is exactly the same. In the feed-in tariff case, you have a lot of cash sort of in the later part of the timeline.
Right.
Whereas the tax rebate case, you had less of that. So from a homeowner perspective, if he or she were to sell the home, the value of this thing is going to be different in these two cases because, in the tax rebate case, you have taken a lot of the value away already. Right?
That's correct. That's correct. But even so we don't have that consideration. This is a very important consideration that has to do with essentially how convex the cost function is for the households of accessing the financial market. So is it better? How much better is it to get a lump sum of money right away as opposed to having a stream of cash flows over time for the household? And there are preferences from the household's perspective in that regard. But even taking that away, even assuming that this household is completely indifferent between the stream of cash flows or the lump sum payment right now, as long as they have to make a decision between those two choices right now. Even assuming that away, because the households have this timing option, this is where strategic behavior of the households becomes very important. The fact that they can wait and install later when they think it's more convenient for them, when they think it's more likely they'll benefit from this. This type of waiting behavior makes the household wait longer than what the government would want them to do.
So that is, you're saying, in the case of the feed-in-tariff situation?
In both cases, this is a true statement. It's just that the government can control
in both cases
in different ways.
Okay, so, but in the case of the tax rebate, so there is some, sort of lumpy timing issues there, right? So year-end, sort of decision horizons. As regimes change, they might take the tax rebate away. So I think the timing flexibility you have on the tax rebate side is probably lower, right?
So the variability on the tax side comes from the fact that the cost of installation changes over time. Because of the improvements in technology, improvements in the processes, fluctuations in the commodity markets for the solar panel ingredients. Components, right? Those costs, they overall tend to go down, but they fluctuate a little bit. But the important part, they change. So if we are a household and we're thinking about, well, should we install the solar panel this year or next year? We have a strong incentive to wait until the next year, because next year our cost of installation will be much lower than this year. But the government wants to encourage us to install sooner rather than later to start deriving the environmental benefits. And so we, as a household, want to have some kind of incentive telling us, hey, don't worry about the fact that the cost is going down. We're going to, as a government, we're going to set the policy in place that you as a household, you kind of indifferent between investing now versus next year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they can also sort of a little bit of a stick in there too, that they could say we're going to take the rebate away next year.
Yeah,
this actually happens.
Change at least the parameters of the policy. Yeah, this has happened. For example, in Germany, they had to reevaluate their feed-in tariff levels, and the reason they had to reevaluate the levels is because the feed-in tariff promise that was given was no longer reflective of the prevailing market prices. And so the feed-in tariff policies weren't providing enough of an incentive for the households. So that happened.
Right. So these are both tax rebate.
Yeah, go ahead.
So both tax rebate and feed-in tariff, they are fixed amounts, so they don't vary by percentages, right?
So implementation differs. So different countries have different versions of those policies. Some countries have a combination of those policies. For example, as far as I know, India has some version that combines elements of the tax rebates and feed-in tariff at the same time. So implementation details vary, but overall, the idea is what uncertainty you want to control as a government, right? So the unfortunate thing is, from the government's perspective, is that households are too smart. They are delaying the investment because of the variability of cash flows, either because of the price of electricity or because of the cost going down. And what the government wants to do is remove that strategic weighting on the part of the households, because that strategic weighting is optimal for the households, but it's suboptimal for the economy overall.
Right. And so you found some policies to be more beneficial in certain cases, and so what was sort of the summary?
So the big takeaway is that when we are in the economy where there's significant variability in prices of electricity, then the better policy is to implement feed-in tariff. when we are in an economy where the cost of the solar panels is variable, then a better policy is to go for the tax rebate. In addition to that,
so
in addition to that,
no, so intuitive.
Well, I get finish my sentence now. In addition to that, we have other dimension of variability, which is how heterogeneous households are in the economy, in their generating ability, right? So if my house is in the shade and your house is in the sun, even so we install the same panels, the amount of electricity we generate is quite different, depending which direction the house is facing, depending how many sunny days, cloudy days per year my neighborhood gets versus your neighborhoods, we get different generation. And turns out that because of the variability in the generating efficiency of the different households, these two policies also have different effects. And because of this, if we have a significant heterogeneity in the efficiency of the households, then tax rebate works much better.
And so government's optimum policy intuitively is really reducing the aggregate uncertainty faced by the
That's
consumer,
right.
whereas revenue or cost.
That's
right?
a very significant factor in the government's decision. How can we reduce the uncertainty? Because by reducing uncertainty, we expedite the investment on the part of the consumers without spending any more additional resources, right? So we can do two things. We can give households way more value, or we can structure the way we give in the value such that even without giving additional money to the households behave as if we're giving them more value.
Right, right. I don't have it in front of me, but I remember you also found an interesting thing when you have high correlation between cost and revenue.
That's right.
Right. So what was the finding there?
So the idea is that if you have a significant correlation between the cost and the revenue, then the tax rebate works better. If you have a significant negative correlation between the cost and the revenue, then feed-in-tariff works better. And this is happening due to what we call a natural hedge. From the government's perspective, what happens is that this will take a little bit of time to explain, so I apologize right away for a long statement that is about to come out. So if we consider feed-in-tariff policies, if there's a positive correlation between the cost of the solar panels and the prices of electricity, then what would happen is that when we have a low investment costs, more households will sign up. The most households sign up, that they will be signing up under the positive correlation when the price of electricity, the market price, is lower. The government, which is effectively guaranteeing a high price of electricity through the feed-in-tariff, ends up being a loser, right? Because we have low households signing up at the time when the value of electricity is actually quite small, but the government pays a large amount on the feed-in-tariff to the household. So this gap between what the government pays and how much it's actually worth is quite large. Now, on the tax rebate, it doesn't exist. If the correlation is positive, then when the households sign up, so they sign up only when the ratio between the prices and the cost exceeds certain value. And that ratio, when the correlation is positive, almost doesn't change. And so even so, the prices themselves are highly variable, even so the costs themselves are highly variable, but because they're positively correlated from the perspective of the households, there's very little variability in their cash flows overall. And so that reduces the uncertainty of the households, and so the government doesn't need to compensate the households nearly as much.
Yeah, so ultimately it reduces the volatility on the revenue side when you have high correlation, right? And so if I understand this correctly, Rod, so in most cases, it appears that tax rebate policies are dominant, except in a case where price variability is very high, and it is sort of either uncorrelated with cost or has some sort of negative correlation, which is unlikely. Let's say uncorrelated with cost, and has high price variability. That's the only case where you have feed-in-tariff to be dominant.
In the table, that is certainly a correct statement. In practice, we need to allocate what fraction of the time we end up in that situation versus other situations, right? And so there are other parameters that we need to consider, like the environmental benefits the government derives for the whole society. They affect how much the government prefers one policy versus another policy. Depending on various parameters that we end up observing in practice. We might have been quite popular. It's just that relative to status quo, if we change the parameter a little bit, it might become less popular relative to tax rebate, but it's still a popular policy. So it's really relative to each other, which one is kind of becoming more or less popular as we change the variability in prices, variability in costs, correlation and heterogeneity. But the government might still be better off with using feed-in tariff in a lot of cases. It depends on how.
There's I would imagine there is a cultural dimension to this too. It's a function of how the households internalizes information. How do they look at risk, and those types of things. And from a practical perspective, when you have feed-in tariff, you have actually higher variability, I think, on your budgets, right? As opposed to tax rebates. And so from a policy perspective, you have to think about that.
So if the households are highly risk averse because they don't have easy access to the market to smooth out their consumption, then they would value the tax rebate, the big lump sum payment, more so than gradual payments from the feed-in tariff. So if we have a country where this is the case, then they should certainly lean more towards given tax rebates.
Yeah, so I don't know if we can do this, but can we read into this idea that tax rebates are more common in America as opposed to EU and places like India? Is there anything that sort of says that the population's expectations are different?
It could be that explanation. Another explanation could be that in the US there's much more variability in the weather, in the sun exposure. Like even if we take California, if you go from Southern California to Northern California, there's quite a bit of variability in the exposure to sun, number of sunny days and how much you can generate electricity from it. As opposed to if you look at Netherlands, that's much more uniform, I guess, weather patterns. I mean, they may be not sunny, but they're uniform. And same goes for Spain, right? So it's a sunny place, but it's consistently sunny. And so if you have very high variability in your sunny days across the population, then tax rebate is a preferred policy. So that might be the explanation. That's in my mind, that is a more likely reason why tax rebate is used more in the US. We are a big country.
Okay.
And
right. Yeah, that makes sense. I want to go into another paper, again, very different area. So R&D investments in the presence of knowledge spillover and debt financing. I find it really, really interesting. And so you say that in an industry with knowledge spillover and debt financing, equilibrium investments in R&D projects are subject to different economic forces. Spillover meaning a firm partakes in R&D and that information gets out to market. Somebody else can take advantage of that. And spillover also causes free riding. So somebody can sit back and say, let somebody else invest. And then once information is available, I can sort of free ride on that. And then you are connecting that idea with the capital structure of the firm and how those incentives could potentially counteract this, right? So my experience is from pharmaceutical R&D, and I can see, essentially the sort of the same sort of things there too. But you're looking at, I think, shale, right?
That was the initial motivation
as a use case. Yeah. So do
sure,
you want to talk
absolutely.
a bit about that paper?
There's no shortage of news about the shale oil and shale gas. When we started working on this paper, the motivation was, well, this is an industry that is exploding. The amount of oil and gas that was generated through fracking exceeded that of like regular normal production. It made the U.S. the net exporter of oil. If we think about back to the 70s, 80s, when U.S. was a big importer of oil, now we're the big exporter. And so it's an industry that is very important to understand what is going on there. So it seems to be very, very fast-growing industry. And the other trend that we observed at the same time is that in that industry, the leverage of the firms was just going through the roof. We have a picture from like The Economist, and we have leverage gone up 5 times in 12 years in the shale industry. So it gone from just about 1 to about 5. And so we were thinking, is there a connection? I mean, there's obviously a connection, but is there a causal connection that might be explaining both the growth in the industry and the fact that we have this very high leverage? Is, if the leverage is driving the growth, what is the mechanism by which this is happening, right? Besides the obvious one, if you have more money sloshing around, you're going to put that money somewhere. And I think we have a good explanation of at least one force that might be happening. And this is interesting because now we see that many of those shale firms are failing because they cannot sustain the high leverage that they picked up initially. And there's a significant consolidation happening right now in the shale industry, which is due to the fact that the leverage is just unsustainable. There's just way too much leverage. But the interesting part in our story is that it says that despite what we normally think of finance, that debt is bad, that could lead to all kind of negative outcomes, that could actually have a positive social effect. And that comes in the form of creating an incentive for the firms to take risks. Right? So in your classical finance literature, debt is a bad thing because there's this force that owners of the firm, the insiders of the firm, if they get money from the external investors in the form of debt, that encourages the insiders of the firm to start taking risks, right? They go and they gamble with somebody else's money. So why not gamble, right? So go to the casino. What we're arguing is that sometimes we want them to go and gamble. And when do we want to them to go and gamble. We want them to go and gamble in the cases where they would have been underinvesting in good projects otherwise. And the shale investment, we think, was one such example. The idea there was that shale technology has developed quite rapidly. The reason it developed quite rapidly is because it's fairly easy to imitate. It's not like pharmaceutical where you have strict patents that if one firm invests in a drug and they discover this drug, they get to keep this drug in their portfolio for a long time and reap the benefits, right? Nobody else can start producing exactly the same drug until the patent has expired. So that's not the level of protection that exists in the shale industry. If somebody comes up with a great idea of drilling horizontally and then taking turns and going sideways and all of those wonderful technological developments and putting particular kind of chemicals on the ground that makes it easier to extract the oil, it's impossible to keep it to yourself. Somebody else will copy it right away. You cannot stop them. And so,
yeah, it's interesting, Brad. So I think you're right about the pharma R&D problem, but there is actually quite a significant spillover effect there too, which is firms can sit back and look. So there are classes of chemicals, right? So when somebody starts inventing in an area, you get a lot of information around the toxicology effects of that class, and you can actually build on it.
Right.
So if you look at the pharma industry, you will find that very successful products in the pharma industry are never the first ones. It's typically the second or third ones.
Right. Right. Yeah. So there's the first mover advantage, but there's a second mover advantage too. You are making expensive mistakes. That's right.
That's right. So in this case, you're saying, so when you take high levels of debt, the equity of the firm, is sort of out of the money call option that becomes more and more, tempting for managers of the firm to really take tremendous amount of risk, because that's the only way they're going to make money.
That's right. That's right. And so what we end up having is that if we would be, what's important here is the word equilibrium, right? So equilibrium in the industry is that if we have a number of firms who are considering either doing innovative projects or doing copycat projects, we want at least some of them to do innovative projects as a society, right? And so, but from their perspective, selfishly, they look around and they say, well, I'm actually much better off waiting for somebody else to take the first step and then seeing if they succeed or not. And if they succeed, I'll just copy them, right? I want to be a copycat. It's much better strategy from the selfish perspective, from individual firm perspective. But as you said, if we have a high level of debt, the only way then for the managers and insiders of the firm to make money is to start taking on more of the innovative projects, more risky projects that would have huge payoffs if they're successful, or you lose all of the money that you have. But it's somebody else's money, so what do you care, right? And I'm being facetious. Of course you care. But what's interesting is that if we look at this industry from the perspective of society, what do we want them to do? We want some of them to innovate, or we want more of them to innovate than actually do if we leave them to their own devices. We cannot just go there and, well, we have a number of mechanisms. We can go and create policy and maybe give tax incentives for innovation, and we have lots of tools that we can provide. But why not use the tool that's already there, which is they're already taking on significant amount of money? Why not encourage them to take on more money, more debt? And what we show is that if they do take more debt, effectively, this drives them towards the solution which is optimal for the society. Right? So the interesting part for us there, it's kind of cute result, is that the free riding is a bad thing if it exists on its own.
Right.
The risk taken when you have too much debt, it's also a bad thing when it exists on its own. But if you take those two negative forces and you merge them in one industry, suddenly these two negative forces create a positive result, which is the outcome. It's as if we as a society were telling them what to do and they were following us.
Right. Right. I was reading the paper. I also wondered, this will be a minor effect, but do you think there'll be some effect of sort of the compensation structures of the firms? If compensation is more skewed toward options and
Definitely.
those types of things, that might have a positive effect as well, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So depending how the managers who are making those decisions are compensated, if they are encouraged to take on more risks, so if they have lots of options in their compensation portfolio, that will exacerbate the effect of taking on more debt. It effectively increases the leverage from their perspective, and they'll take on more risky projects. If they have, however, significant job concerns, right? So the force that might be working against us here is that when firms fail, for managers, it's not a good thing. It's hard for the markets to differentiate between managers that failed because they don't have the right skills, they're not competent, and managers who just weren't lucky and the industry forces kind of made it so that their firm failed and the next firm will be super successful. Because of inability of the markets, labor markets, to differentiate between failure due to your incompetence and just bad luck, the managers have significant incentive not to fail. And that makes them more risk averse, and that could work against us here.
Right, right. Yeah, so it's interesting, so there is a sort of a firm level interesting observation, which is if you are in a high knowledge spillover industry with a lot of free riding problems, those firms might be better off having compensation very much skewed toward risk taking, encouraging risk taking in the firm. That might push them to a more optimum position from an investment posture. And more macro observation, if I understand this correctly, Brad, you're saying that perhaps it might be even beneficial to have to encourage higher levels of debt. So would there be tax policies that would do that?
That would steer the firms towards taking more debt. That's certainly one way to accomplish that. Yes, absolutely. Right. So when you are given a tax shield on the interest payments, that's a classic example that the tax policies are pushing the firms towards taking on more debt.
Right, right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this has been great, Vlad. I'm sorry we couldn't get to some of your other papers. I found all of them extremely interesting.
You're very kind. Thank you.
And good luck with all this research.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.